I'm Selena.
And I'm Sydney.
And today we're talking about yeast.
Yeast. Where did it come from? How do we discover it? And how do we still use it today? The first known history of yeast can actually be traced back to the ancient Egyptians 5,000 years ago. The reaction was seen as a magical phenomenon at the time and may have been discovered when someone left flour and water out on a warm day, and the natural yeast in the flour caused it to ferment. People at the time also used to leave fruits and grains in closed containers to create wine and beer, but no one knew why this reaction occurred or why the beverages would ferment. This reaction actually occurred because people used to stomp on the fruit before putting it in jars in order to create alcohol. By doing so, they were leaving behind natural microorganisms from their feet into the fruit. These microorganisms were called yeast, and they helped the fruit ferment. However, no one would know about this reaction until the 17th century, when a Dutch tradesman named Anthony van Leeuwenhoek used lenses to observe yeast for the first time. He saw that the yeast was the cause of the fermentation and that the microorganisms were actually alive. Our more modern understanding of yeast came from the French chemist Louis Pasteur, who was also known as the creator of pasteurization. He experimented to discover that glucose by way of yeast turns into ethanol and CO2, and CO2 gas was the reason the bread became fluffier before baking. He also observed that this entire process occurred without the presence of oxygen, which is why people used to use closed containers in order to make alcohol. In history, humans actually relied on beer and wine instead of water because the alcohol made the beer cleaner to drink. And most ancient civilizations relied on bread and grains in order to sustain their society. But it's with our more modern understanding of yeast that has helped improve techniques for baking and brewing.
Now, let's go into some depth about the chemical reactions of yeast. The almighty yeast is an absolute necessity in our cooking today. It's used in places where we wouldn't even realize. Of course, for things like bread and bagels, but it's also used for things like yogurt, alcohol, and cereal. Now, yeast is a microscopic bacteria, part of the fungi kingdom. Not that kind of fungi. That's right, we're talking about the mushroom kingdom. So how, really, does yeast even work? In order to understand this, we have to think about the chemical reactions of yeast. Yeast uses a chemical process called alcoholic fermentation. This is a decomposition reaction where sugars, like glucose, are broken down to alcohol and CO2 by the yeast. Although yeast is tiny, only the size of our red blood cells, it can do a lot when it's hungry. Yeast loves to eat sugar, and it gains all its energy from feeding on it, so obviously if it's hungry, it's going to look for sugar. So yeast likes sugar and eats it, but so what? In order to better understand yeast's chemical reactions, we have to ask ourselves, why exactly does yeast make bread inflate? Well, we have to first think about what bread is made out of in order to understand this question. That's right, bread is made out of glucose, which is sugar, lots and lots of sugar. The bread is at first flat and boring, but once the sugar-eating yeast comes into action, it feeds on the glucose in the bread. This causes the chemical reaction of alcoholic fermentation. One of the products, CO2, is then released from the yeast, and since it's trapped inside the walls of the bread, it makes the bread rise. This is what creates the fluffy bread that we love to eat today. Yeast is a bacteria that has changed the eating habits of Homo sapiens. It is crucial to our lives today, and it's hard to imagine a life without yeast.